All right, planet Earth, you wanted the best, you got the best.
Hey, this is not a test. This is rock and roll.
Dave Erickson, Mark Anderson.
Locked and loaded.
When it comes to talk, they're the purveyors of power, the bailiffs of bombast, rock and roll renegades.
We're about to witness the greatest miracle of the machine age.
Turn it up to 11. Here they are, Mark and Dave. Let there be rock.
All right, welcome to this little slice of earth that we like to call Let There Be Rock. I'm Dave.
I'm Mark.
Thanks so much for joining us. As always, can't tell you how much we appreciate it. We are continuing. This is part 2 of our mega episode, the rock documentaries every rock fan must see.
You know, there is so many out there that we had to do 2 episodes. I think the cool thing about rock docs is you learn something and you also get to hear some good music too.
You know, it's funny because we had this whole list of the rock documentaries, again, that we believe you must see. Now, we do get comments on our Facebook page and in other platforms, and I saw one of our comments, Mark, that it's like just a list of rock documentaries as though we somehow missed them. Look, Mark and I have seen everything for the most part.
Oh, I would say so.
So this is the list of the ones that we think are essentials to your collection, or even if you don't own them, at least see them. We feel like they're essential. We're not necessarily giving a list of 100 rock documentaries. You know, that would go on forever. These are the ones that you must see if you're a rock fan, in our minds anyway.
Because trust me, we know everyone that's out there.
We do. And so, all right, so this is part 2. We had a number of really great ones, some that I'd forgotten about that you brought up last week. I thought they were good. So this week, Mark, I know that you have a really pretty solid list. So where are we in terms of rock documentaries every rock fan must see, part 2?
Well, I think if you're a Rush fan, the must-see one is Beyond the Lighted Stage.
Okay. They
have interviews with Vinnie Paul, Sebastian Bach, tons of people that were influenced by Rush. I believe that the guy from Tool's in there, the drummer from Tool. And they really respect this band. And you figure it's a 3-piece band from Canada. And they had originally they were opening for Kiss. And then right in the mid-70s, after 2112, they just broke.
They did. The only thing, and we can have, somebody said that we should do a whole episode on Rush. I'm not necessarily agreeing with that. However, we can have a pretty good conversation. The thing about Rush, for me, it's interesting, and I think this documentary will probably go to maybe swaying people who aren't the biggest fans of Rush to see how they broke. You're right. This was a great time for them. My favorite Rush, though, would have to be really at the beginning because they were more of a meat and potatoes, blue collar kind of rock and roll band.
Yeah, like the first one and Fly By Night.
Yeah,
and they were. And then they kind of got a little more detailed, and definitely were more cerebral.
Yeah. Well, take a look at Working Man. Okay, you look at the lyrics for Working Man, and it's good, solid, blue-collar working man lyrics, right? Next thing you know, Neil Peart is writing these lyrics that Bytor and the Snow Dog. What the hell does that even mean?
Well, the first album, he wasn't on there. So,
well, there you go.
Yeah, so I think once they got Neil, the whole vibe of the band changed, and for the better.
Okay, so, and again, he had the 798-piece drum kit that he brought to the table.
Each and every tour.
Can you imagine being the drum tech for Neil Peart?
Yeah, that must be quite the
right.
Quite the job.
Now, I've got my list, Mark. I've got this week, I didn't plan it this way, but I've got a lot of very punk, new wave kind of selections, although this first one I bring up is neither of those things. I would say a rock documentary every rock fan must see is It Might Get Loud.
Yeah, that one, when I first saw it, I could not believe it was Jimmy Page, The Edge, and Jack White, and how they gel, and just how their guitar playing kind of came together.
Yeah, it was just such a well done documentary. It's the three of those guys. And there are breakaway, the filmmakers sort of broke away and told each one of their stories about how they came to be in a rock band, how they became guitar players, and sort of how their bands blew up. And then they gathered those three into a room where they shared stories about guitars, their interests, their big songs, and they taught each other how to play their biggest hits. And, Mark, the scene that really sticks out for me, there are two. Both of them sort of involve Jack White. One is when they open the movie, there's Jack White. He's got a hammer and a nail and a little piece of rotted wood. He's hammering these nails into this wood. He's got a piece of wire that he strings around the nails. Then he puts he hammers an old guitar pickup into this little piece of wood, plugs the wood or the pickup into a little pig nose amplifier, and starts playing this piece of wire. And he starts making music with it, like a slide guitar, a blues riff. And he looks at the camera and goes, "It's not about the instrument."
Yeah, well, it is pretty amazing. I mean, having seen something like that constructed and then hearing it was pretty mind-blowing.
And then he's sitting there with Edge and Jimmy Page is showing how he played Kashmir. And Jack White, Whole Lot of Love. Jimmy Page is playing Whole Lot of Love. He's showing the Edge and Jack White how to play A Whole Lot of Love, Zeppelin's classic, and they're just staring at him, awestruck. Can you imagine, Mark, sitting there in the room with Jimmy Page and he's teaching you how to play Whole Lot of Love?
That would be pretty much the ultimate guitar lesson from anyone.
Man, it's just a great movie if you really dig rock and roll. And you don't have to be a fan of U2 or White Stripes or Raconteurs or even Zeppelin for that matter to really enjoy this film. But I would say if you're not a fan of Led Zeppelin, you probably don't want to listen to this show.
I think too with that documentary, you see three distinct generations. So Jack White's, you see the Edge, and you see Jimmy Page. And to see all of them come together, and they're very similar, but different at the same time.
And it's just really telling, and I think it's cool because, last week we talked about a documentary called The Decline of Western Civilization, Part 2, The Metal Years, where kids in this guys in bands all talked about becoming rock stars, being rich and famous and limos and chicks and all that. But when you listen to Jack White, The Edge, and Jimmy Page talk about their beginnings, they didn't discuss any of that. All they wanted to do was play music.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it's all about for all of them.
Yeah, so it might get loud. You got to check that one out.
That's a must.
It is a must. All right. What's next, Mark?
All right. Another one that's one of my favorites, and it's in two parts on the DVD. It goes from like an hour and a half and all of a sudden expands to 3 hours, which is the history of the Eagles.
Okay.
And if you're a fan of the Eagles, this is a must. It goes from when they first started out, when they met Linda Ronstadt, and they were kind of like her backing band for a while. Through all their years, through when they got Joe Walsh, they had issues with Don Felder. Which they had issues with him numerous times. They also, when they had got Timothy B. Schmidt in, and how they all came together. And Joe Walsh, he really put another dimension to that band where they were more of a country rock band prior. Then he hit Hotel California with Joe Walsh, and it became a legitimate kind of a hard rock band in some of their songs like Life in the Fast Lane. But check it out because you really get an insight to with Don Henley and Glenn Frey. And there's tension there throughout the whole career, but that tension made who they were. That's why I really like it. And it really shows, not only does it show, they interview all the band members separately and you get their take.
You would have to interview them separately.
You really would. Yes, especially a couple of them.
Well, look, you know what? People don't fully appreciate, I think, that rock bands are like families, and there's going to be tension. There's going to be dysfunction. There's going to be all those relationship type issues with band members that you have in actual family. And so, yeah, some days you hate your brother or your sister or whatever, your dad or your mom, and you have issues, and it's no different in some of these bands. And throw in all those millions of dollars and the creative, aspect of it. People who are creative are a little bit more high strung, I think, sometimes. And so you factor all of those things in, throw it into the mix, and boom, you have dysfunction. But my God, they make great music.
I have always been an Eagles fan, but watching that documentary and seeing it from point A to all the way through to the reunion tour, it gave me a new perspective on the whole band itself, and I became an even bigger fan.
All right. And what's the name of that again?
History of the Eagles.
There you go. History of the Eagles. All right. Next on my list, and again, we're not sort of at the punk part of this yet, but you've got to see, all right, everybody knows about Spinal Tap, and I had wondered whether to include that because that's not a real documentary. It's a mockumentary.
But classic. You've got to see Spinal Tap. So I can't necessarily say that is a rock documentary every rock fan must see because it's not really technically a documentary. It's a mockumentary, but it's fantastic. You have to see Spinal Tap. But with that in mind, a lot of people have referred to this documentary as a real life Spinal Tap, and it is Anvil, the story of Anvil. This thing. Do you remember Anvil from the 80s, Mark? I really didn't. And then when this documentary came out, I checked it out, and it was a train wreck. So at that point, I went and saw him in concert, and it was like one of those bands you say, well, I saw once. And because of the documentary, there's a reason why they really didn't make it big.
They had one hit. They had one, Metal on Metal. They had one hit, and it's so funny in this documentary. Lars Ulrich from Metallica shows up in all these dang documentaries like he's a freaking expert in every band. And you know what? God bless Lars. He's sitting there. They're interviewing him about Anvil, and Lars is like, they were really influential. They were a big part of, Metallica's, history. Oh, bullshit.
I agree. It's like, they weren't influential on anyone. They weren't the US Festival. They got a lucky break there. I think that they were more seen because of the US Festival, but if it wasn't for that, no one would have ever known them.
That's true. But I think what's fascinating about this documentary and why I included it on my list is it's about somebody holding on to a dream. And you have to ask yourself whether, maybe it's in your own life, you're hanging on to something because you see this guy in the band who's the head of Anvil, a guy named Lips with 2 P's, right? But so he, at what point do you give up on a dream? Do you say, this is just futile? And at what point do you just really sort of continue to try to live it and make it happen? They didn't really make it in the 80s, and this guy in this film is just continuing to try and pursue gigs for Anvil. They all have regular jobs, and then somehow they hook in with a producer who helps them with another demo tape to get a record deal. And they play gigs in Europe, of course. Those Europeans, they're huge in Belgium, right? And so, I don't know. I think it really asks the question, when is it, there's a difference between sort of dedication and delusion.
Yeah, and I think, like you were saying, that they're still like chasing that dream. And good for them for that. I think they had their 15 minutes of fame, and it kind of proves it in the movie. Nonetheless, the movie's entertaining. If you're not into Anvil or never heard of Anvil, it's worth checking out. But at the same time, it didn't turn me into a fan, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it is. And it is well done. And doggone it, Lips is just such a likable guy. You know what? You wish he could make it. But dude, you're like 65 years old now, bro. If it hasn't happened for you, it's probably not going to. But if you're out doing if this movie gave Anvil an opportunity to play bar gigs and they're making some money and they're having fun, God bless them.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Mark, what's next?
So my next one is this one's kind of a special one to me. Back when I was, I think it was probably 5th grade, my dad took me to see The Last Waltz. Have you ever seen that movie?
I have. It's been a while, but it came out in the late 70s.
It did. And it was from their last performance I believe it was at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco.
The band, the last performance of the band.
And they were actually the backing band for Bob Dylan.
Right.
And so my dad took me, and I was really wanting to see something else other than that.
Well, yeah.
It was kind of like on the verge of being a concert film, but yet documentary. So it was kind of on that cusp. But I do remember when they did Up in Cripple Creek. That's when all of a sudden I was like, wow, I'm glad I'm here. And it kind of changed my tune about that style of music, where at that time I was just into Kiss and Aerosmith. So I kept opened up about that. And it really is this history of time and music where it was their last performance at that time. And most of the band right at this point has passed. So you should go check it out. It's entertaining, and you'll learn about this band that became famous for being the band from Bob Dylan.
Right. I like the fact that they're just called the band.
Exactly. Very simple.
I've always said that if I was in a band that was like, you know, good enough to be like an opening band for anybody, I would name our band Special Guests. That way, when the posters came out, the Rolling Stones with special guests. There we are.
You're always up there.
We were always on the bill. Always. Hey, check it out. AC/DC and special guests. All right, next up on my list of the rock documentaries every rock fan must see. And this is available on Amazon Prime. It is called The Glamour and the Squalor. It is the story of a rock DJ named Marco Collins, who is a Seattle DJ, one of the last of the great rock DJs. He broke Nirvana. He was the first to really sort of push the Seattle scene, broke Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Beck, and he was really instrumental, all the while fighting his own personal demons. It is a fascinating look at a guy who is a bit of a visionary in the world of rock music. In fact, this guy is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
He is.
Yes, he is. It is called The Glamour and the Squalor. Check it out on Amazon Prime.
Yeah, I'll need to check that one out. I've never even heard of that. So that sounds like something that's right up my alley anyway. I used to be a disc jockey years ago, so I really like to see that.
So yeah, he was really influential. I mean, you've got guys like, you know, and they're sort of the unsung. Everybody knows Alan Freed, right, from Cleveland, and he was the one, I think, who didn't he coin the phrase rock and roll?
He did.
And so we know him. We know Dick Clark, of course. But then you have guys like Rodney Bingenheimer, who was at K-Rock in Los Angeles, but he's the mayor of the Sunset Strip, and they actually had a documentary about him called The Mayor of the Sunset Strip. And this guy broke bands like Blondie and the Ramones and on the West Coast because he was the first guy on the radio to start playing them out there. So I think a lot of times these disc jockeys are sort of unsung. And you hear about Kurt Cobain and Nirvana and the greatness and all that, but without radio play back then, where would they have been? And so, yeah.
And back then, radio play was so much more important than it is today. It's sad. It really is a lost art. Unfortunately, a lot of the stations that are playing songs today just play retreads.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
The ones they play, they don't really have any new breaking out songs at all. So I haven't listened to the radio, I hate to say, in quite some time because of that.
We should do a documentary. We should do a rock documentary on that, and then it'll be one that everyone should see.
Hey, I like that. I like that. That's a good idea.
All right. So now I'm kicking into my sort of punk kind of thing. All right. So where are we going now, though, with your selection?
Okay, I got a bonus one here.
All right.
While we were talking, I thought about this one when we started talking about Anvil. There's a band called Pentagram. And they were from the 80s and 90s. It's called Last Days Here. It's about Bobby Liebling, the lead singer, and I would say they were ever like really famous, but his fall from his fame in that band, where he ended up a drug addict in his mother's house. And this fan came and got him, not rehabbed him, but he befriended him and helped him clean up and get back on the stage after many years of being
that's cool
away from the spotlight.
Oh, that sounds cool. What's the name of the film again, Mark?
It's called Last Days Here. It's from 2011.
Okay. That sounds really cool.
It's very interesting. It is sad when you first see what's going on, but then it really turns very heartwarming. This fan really, really loves this band, and he is going to do everything to get them back on the stage again.
Well, all right. Did he? I mean, it was from his pen.
He did. He did. In fact, they were in the Dallas area not too long ago. Pentagram was.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, all right. And thanks to that fan. If you're a Pentagram fan, thank that fan. All right.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Next up on my list is there's a lot of rise and fall stories coming up in my selections here. I think anybody who's really a fan of rock and roll has got to see The Filth and the Fury. It is a documentary about the rise and fall and the influence of the Sex Pistols. This film is awesome. I mean, they interview Johnny. They interview everybody, really. And we've talked about this in the past, too. A lot of people don't realize Sid Vicious was not the original bass player for the Sex Pistols. Sid Vicious did not play on their one and only studio album. Sid Vicious didn't write any songs. He could barely even play the bass. So this talks about the genesis of the band, that, they were born basically out of a clothing shop called Sex, owned by Malcolm McLaren in London. But they got Johnny Rotten. They were just pretty much a straight ahead rock and roll band they were building up some popularity, but they went on a TV show called The Bill Grundy Show in London that was so foul-mouthed and it was so disgusting that they ended up on the front page of every newspaper in the UK the next day. And The Filth and the Fury was actually one of the headlines. That's why they named the movie The Filth and the Fury. And that's when the Sex Pistols basically ended up becoming extremely notorious, more for their antics than for their awesome music.
Because that first album is pretty badass.
It is. And it's punk, it's not really quote unquote punk. It's just a rock and roll record.
The attitude is punk.
Yeah. And they did something that not a lot of people did in 1977. They were taking the teen angst. They were making statements about the political situation and the climate at the time. And nobody was really they weren't singing about chicks, and drugs and all that stuff. I mean, for crying out loud. I mean, their song Bodies is about some crazy woman who had an abortion and showed up at one of their gigs with the kid. So nobody was singing about stuff like that in 1977.
And that's, if you think about it, a lot of metal bands like Metallica, Megadeth, really need to credit Sex Pistols as far as the attitude and not just doing, music about chicks, but they had a political statement to make.
And so long before the Clash, you had the Sex Pistols. And so the movie is called The Filth and the Fury. And, sort of in keeping with the theme of punk, Mark, you can't talk about the Sex Pistols without talking about the Ramones, without talking about the Stooges. Next on my list of rock documentaries every rock fan must see is called Gimme Danger. This came out on Netflix a couple of years ago. Iggy Pop talks about the Stooges, the genesis of the Stooges, the Raw Power record, their rise, their fall, their reunion. I think the Stooges get often overlooked, Mark, in the conversation about the greats of rock and roll and punk. We hear about the Pistols, the Ramones. Not as many people talk about the Stooges, but they should.
I agree. They were there right in the mix of the 70s. Am I correct? They're from New York?
Detroit.
Oh, then I'm way off on that one. But they definitely, a lot of those punk bands came from Europe or UK. Mm-hmm. And having Iggy Pop, having the punk movement here, that was a very big thing.
And a lot of people don't realize how long they have been around. The Stooges, if you go back, I think it was 1970. Actually, it was 67, now that I think about it, through the early 70s. Can you imagine in an era when you're coming out of the flower power of the 60s and all of that, and the early 70s, you start hearing songs like Raw Power. Think about the power of those Iggy and the Stooges songs in the early 70s, at the dawn of a new decade. They were well before the Pistols, well before the Ramones.
Yeah, I think when you think back in the 70s, you don't think about punk, especially from America. So I'm glad that this documentary kind of shows and explores this side of the American music in the punk side.
Detroit, baby. I mean, we're talking about, let's see, the Stooges.
Not New York.
No, not New York. Think about Detroit. You got the Stooges, at the MC5, Ted Nugent, Kid Rock. Detroit has had some freaking great music, man.
Yeah, they really have. I mean, even with like the Motown. Obviously, everyone knows about that, but the rock is really, really huge out there.
Yeah, White Stripes, Jack White, I mean, I love going back to that. It might get loud. I like the story Jack White told of, he had a pickup truck, which means he was always stuck having to be the guy who helped someone move. And so I guess he helped a guy move a refrigerator, and then he didn't have any money to pay him. So he owned like a secondhand store, and he said, hey, just pick out something. That'll be your payment. And so Jack got his first guitar. He helped a guy move. And so that's how we got a guitar. I just thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and I can't forget about Bob Seger being from Detroit as well. Got to throw that in there.
Like a rock. All right, and the final one here, we're running a little tight on time, but I'm going to wrap it up with a documentary from 1980. This is a unique one, Mark, because there's no narration in it, not like in a traditional sense. There is sound, of course, but it's called Erg, A Music War, which is about the punk and new wave movement. There are over 30 bands, like 35, 36 new wave bands, big ones. Everybody who was anybody in the punk scene in 1980 is in this film. And it's live concert performances and sound and all that stuff backstage and so forth. And it gives you a really outstanding snapshot of that movement. I think a lot of times what gets lost in the shuffle of when we talk about 80s music, we kind of forget, I think, about the early 80s. We always think about hair metal and all the new wave stuff, but that came later on, like Aha or whatever. But in 1980, 81, 82, when you had Echo and the Bunnymen, OMD, Go-Go's, Elvis Costello.
Sushi and the Banshees.
Yeah, all those bands. Yeah, I mean, that was a huge part of the early 80s, and this movie really captures that.
I need to check that one out, too. There's a lot of these documentaries that you've seen that I haven't, especially in those genres, and I will have to check those out and report back to you as well. I think because the 80s were such a fun time because you had new wave, you had metal, you had hair metal, you had so much more than there is today.
And that's going to be another episode that is soon to come. We want to talk about the music of the 80s because I think that musically, what a great decade. Oh my gosh. I don't know, maybe I'm stuck there, Mark. Maybe I'm stuck in the 80s.
It's not a bad place to be stuck in.
No, people say, where are you from? I always say, the 80s. That's where I'm from. I'm from the 80s. So, all right. Well, that is the end of our super mega extended fat episode, the rock documentaries that every rock fan must see. Now, this is the ones, again, you must see, not just a list of rock documentaries in general. We get comments from people just giving us lists. Look, if you feel that strongly about it, feel free to start your own podcast and talk about them, and we'll be happy to listen. Not a problem, but these are the ones that we really think are essential. So thanks a lot for indulging us, and thanks a lot for listening, and hopefully you'll go watch some of these. I think you'll really enjoy them. So that's it for this week. I'm Dave.
I'm Mark.
Let there be rock.
You've been listening to Mark Anderson and Dave Erickson's Let There Be Rock podcast.
Awesome.
Mark and Dave's opinions are theirs, and not necessarily those of whoever runs whatever platform on which you're listening. But if you don't agree with them, you probably think Jethro Tull deserved to win the first heavy metal Grammy.
What an idiot.
Let There Be Rock is an Anderson Erickson production.
Rock and roll!
It's one louder.